Well, this is such a privilege and a joy. I have none other than Nigel Hannaford with us today. He is a senior voice in the editorial world in Canada with over 30 years of experience in the newspaper business, was also a speechwriter for former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and an incredibly articulate voice on a variety of topics for our nation. Thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you recently wrote an article that was published in the Western Standard that said the Liberal government of Canada is turning its back on Christians. Now, tell us a little bit about this article and why you felt it was so important to write it at this time.
Certainly, there is a clear ideological difference between those of us who try to follow as best we can the teachings of Christ and the federal government in its present iteration, which has signaled through a series of legislative steps and public relations moves that it really would rather have Christianity out of the public square. What sparked me particularly was committee hearings on Bill C9. You may recall that this is the one that they market as combating hate. And during the committee meetings, the Justice Committee chairman, his name is Mark Miller, a veteran MP and I believe a good friend of former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he made the observation that perhaps the defense of a good faith statement from an established religious creed should no longer be satisfactory if certain contentious subjects were being discussed. Not to cut to the chase, there are passages in the Bible which are strongly critical of homosexuality and the gay lifestyle, and some Christians choose to bring it up, and if they are challenged, perhaps at a human rights commission, they're going to say, well, I'm a Christian, it's in the Bible, and therefore that is why you can't tell me to think something different. If it's in the Bible, it's in the Bible. That's it. And he was questioning whether that should be allowed to persist. Now, at the moment, the bill is what it is, and it's at second reading. And I believe that it will go to third after a hearing in committee. However, one member of the Justice Committee, who is a Quebecois member, has said, maybe we should have an amendment to strike that particular defense from the list. It's discriminatory, and therefore it's not to go. That's the view of Théo Fortin. I probably just abused his name in the pronunciation, but at any rate, he is a Quebecois MP, and that is his view. It could happen. So, right now we don't know, but that was the specific thing to answer your question that made me think maybe it's time we talk about that. But there are many other ways in which the federal government has, in the 10 years that it's been in power, attempted to marginalize Christianity.
And this is one of the things that was so fascinating about your article, is that you actually laid a lot of those examples out, times where, as you put it, where language or policies have turned their back perhaps on the Christian community in particular. Share for our viewers some specific examples.
Yes, well, there could hardly be a policy more inimical to Christians than that of unrestricted abortion. Yet very early on during his time in office, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made it clear that anybody who was pro-life, disagreed with abortion, could not serve as a member of the Liberal Party. They would not sign the nomination papers for a candidate. Those who were grandfathered in and were of a pro-life position were marginalized and slowly dropped off, and were not, that particular point of view was not thereafter allowed in the caucus. There was further evidence of their intense interest in maintaining abortion as some sort of modern-day sacrifice to a pagan religion, by even organizations that tried to get kids working in summer jobs were told that if they were working for a pro-life cause, there would be no summer job grounds. There was a particular tick box in the top right-hand corner of the application form. You had to certify that you were not working for a pro-life organization. So they took that position. Not that I have not that I think it matters terribly much whether we call the light display on Parliament Hill a winter display or Christmas display of lights. I think it is interesting and it is indicative of the way the government thinks, that when they had the opportunity a few years ago to rechristen that display, they chose to make it non-denominational. During Remembrance Day's services, chaplains have been ordered not to speak in the name of God, or in the name, and above all, don't mention Jesus. Now, it's pretty obvious that there is a campaign afoot to remove Christianity from the public life of the nation. Just to deal with that point, the men who went to war, the men and the women who went to war in the 1940s and in Korea, if they were religious at all, they were probably Christians. And in the proverbial foxhole, it would be to the Christian God to whom they prayed. But years later, their sons and their grandsons and their daughters and their granddaughters are not allowed to pray to the same God if they happen to be military chaplains. So they're giving the thumbs down to Christianity. I could go on. There's a number of other examples, but that's how this government thinks. And it is they're very organized in their thoughts. This is not random stuff. There is a whole worldview that animates this particular government, and it doesn't care to be reminded that there is a God.
So, what do you think the turning point was for this whole trajectory? And I guess my follow up question to that would be, what do you say to the voices that say, listen, society's moved on, quit moaning about it. You guys are all playing the victims. And yet there are those of us that serve in the public square that are saying, hey, this is a real conversation that needs to be had, because it seems like we are experiencing a real sort of anti-Christian bigotry that's being rolled out in the public square. Where was the turning point, and how would you respond to that question?
Okay, these are important questions. The turning point, I would say the formal turning point was the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. And what changed there was that the court system was put in charge of determining what the law was going to be. There are two ways of looking at at how law should be determined. And for most of Canada's history, it worked under the old British common law system, and what the law said would be determined by elected members who were responsible to the people who elected them. Now, what the Charter did was give judges room to alter laws that they didn't like. You've probably heard people talk about activist judges. I don't know how activist most judges are, but certainly some have heard the cases presented to them in such a way that they say, well, our job is to interpret the law in a way that is acceptable to people as they are today, and not as they were in 1982 or in 1842. And so, therefore, we are going to just make a change. So now you don't have, there is no originalist judge on the Supreme Court of Canada. Nobody who's going to go back to the statute book and say, well, that's what the law says. If Parliament wants something different, they can change it. No, they will change it themselves. So that, I think, was the turning point But I want to make this point very, very clear, Faitine, because it's so easy to get into calling people names and so on. That why would Canada go in that direction? Why would people want that? Why would politicians think there'd be a reward for setting up the Constitution in that way and giving that power to the judges? The answer is the people themselves were wanting it. The first case that came before the Supreme Court of Canada after the Charter was adopted and after this new approach was taken was an act that allowed Sunday shopping. Somebody objected to the fact that under the Lord's Day Act, which had been around for 100 years, you couldn't go and buy a packet of cigarettes on a Sunday. Well, that changed in 1983 when the Big M case was decided, and Sunday shopping that had been statutorily put in place by the elected members of the House of Commons was changed by the unelected members of the judiciary. But don't blame the judiciary, blame the Canadian public that had decided that they weren't really interested in having that kind of restriction placed upon them in perpetuity, and therefore now they had a mechanism to change it. There's a close parallel between how Canadians have responded to changing times and how in the Old Testament the Israelites repeatedly walked away from God. It's the same kind of action that we have just committed ourselves to.
Well, I find this so fascinating, particularly in light of the dynamic in the next generation that we're seeing. It's now being observed that amongst the millennials, there is a much higher percentage of Canadians that are returning back to church, seeking to understand faith, and even returning back to the Sabbath. I know there is a recent book that was just published. Pre-sales are already bestseller, particularly on this topic. So this is all so fascinating. I wonder if we are beginning to come into a correction zone. But as we sort of begin to wrap up our conversation here in the next few minutes, I have two more questions. Number one is there a tide that raises all ships? Looking at 2025, 2026, as people of faith, people who, maybe if we're not people of faith, we value spirituality, we value faith. We see it as a valid part of the fabric of Canadian life. Is there something we can be doing that will help contribute to a positive dynamic in the faith and government intersection? And then talk about in your article how you exhort people of faith to live like the Israelites did in the times when they were in exile in Babylon.
Well, I did say that, and yes, that was a response to a particular situation. They were God said, get on with it, marry, have families, build houses, pray for the condition of the country where I have put you. But I think that although that's a valid instruction, Christians today also have to compare their situation to the persecutions that took place after Christ was raised from the dead and for the first 200 or 300 years in the Roman Empire. They did not resist the authority of the state until they were put on the spot. There was a little ceremony that they had to go through to declare their loyalty to the emperor, and the emperor was declared to be a god, and well, obviously they couldn't participate in that, and it was at that point that you were on the way to the lion's den. Now then, it's let us not be so self-conscious about our situation that Christians living in 21st century Canada should think that they are about to face that kind of ferocious persecution, because right now that is not what it's looking like. Nevertheless, there have been times within the last 5 years, and I'm thinking, of course, about how we handle ourselves during an emergency such as COVID and how we manage ourselves when we look at this progressive removal of symbols that are valuable to us from public life, how should we feel about it? And the answer is, the Bible instructs us to obey the government. right up to the point where the government tells you to do something, which in the name of God you cannot do. At that point, you take your stand. But for now, we are there to do what we have always done, just to help people, to be a relief agency. That's obviously, there's more to being Christian than that, but it's an often forgotten fact that the Christian church is responsible for the first relief agencies, the first universities, schools, first hospitals. And, we carry on being a light on the bushel, the salt to the meal that society is, and to continue to worship God in our own way as long as we possibly can. The time will come when we have to make a stand. That will be the time to talk about how to take it.
I want to close our time with the words that you closed your article with. They were so articulate. You said, draw the line, stand firm, live faithfully, for the God who sustained Daniel in Babylon still reigns over Canada today. In light of all we've discussed today and these words, do you have any closing remarks for our viewers?
Well, first of all, I do think that you have to be aware of what is going on. I mean, there's lots of, I go to a very large church. I'm sure that there are hundreds of people there who really aren't aware that legislation is underway that will limit them. At this moment, there is nothing on the books to remove the charitable donation tax receipt, which so many of us enjoy when we put our tithes in. But that could be taken away. That would be consistent with the worldview that this government has. We also should be aware that there are moves afoot, we've already seen them, to limit our expression of what the Bible says and what the Bible calls us to do. So we need to be aware. We need to support our pastors when they show us that they are aware of what is going on. And above all, what do Christians do? They pray. And they pray for the protection of God. And then they carry on and try to be good citizens.
Absolutely profound. Thank you so much, Mr. Hannaford. Thank you for your article. Thank you for provoking this conversation right now. And thank you for the investment of your time today. We deeply value it.
You're very welcome, Fatine, and congratulations on the work that you do, too. God bless you.